So guys, I just want to welcome everybody to our virtual lecture tonight, especially Dr. Nadya Williams from the University of West Georgia. We're so excited to have you with us. Thank you for coming back. She gave an in-person lecture back in the spring of 2019, I believe, before Roman Army Day. And so we're so thankful to have you back. You're not just a guest speaker, I consider you a friend. And so I'm so thankful for you to be coming and speaking with us today.
Well, thank you. I think I'll go ahead and share my screen. Actually, could you please enable me to do that?
Yes, I thought I did that in advance, but I don't. I guess it just switched it. Okay. Try it again. Awesome.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking with you to you about today is a really fascinating story that perhaps a couple of years ago we would not have thought is relevant for us, but here we are, and I think you'll see as we talk just how relevant this kind of story is. So it's about pastoring through a pandemic, the story of Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, and his church in the mid-3rd century CE. But because it's always fun, you know, no one really enjoys school when they're in school and have to get a grade, but everybody enjoys a quiz when there are no like serious repercussions attached, right? So I figured we'd start with some trivia. And then after that, we'll go to Cyprian and his ministry. So as your warm up, you get a quiz. So feel free to, maybe what we can do is think what the answer is. Like everybody take a few seconds every time I show a question, and then maybe like we can get an answer and then see how you do. So trivia, life in the Roman world. So we're gonna have 5-question quiz. So question 1, what was the next year after 1 BC? So you have options: 2 BC, the year 0, 1 AD, or 2 AD.
One.
Do you want us to say it or write it in the chat?
You can say it.
I'd guess the second one, the year 0, but that's just a guess.
That's what I would guess.
Ready for the answer?
I'd say 1.
Okay. That's the correct answer. There was no year 0. That always trips up students. That's a conversation we have every year because for some, you know, after all the years of math that we've had, by the time you get to college and beyond, you're thinking like, well, after, you know, -1, you get a 0, and then you have +1. Doesn't work that way with historical timelines. There's no year 0. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD. Okay.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Which of the following foods did the Romans not eat? Rabbit, tree rats, also known as dormice, elephant, or pheasant?
I would guess rats, the tree rats.
I think it's C, but I'm not sure.
Anyone else?
I would say C too.
You are correct, but this is an example of a roasted dormouse, Roman style, although definitely served on a modern plate.
It looks like rabbit though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have a cookbook from the mid to late 1st century AD by someone named Apicius. So he collected like popular Roman aristocratic recipes, and he has an entire book in that overall large book is on quadrupeds. So he lists quite a few animals and recipes involving them, including rabbit, and also dormouse. And in fact, dormice were quite popular. That was one of those in vogue meats in the 1st century AD. And there were special farms dedicated to growing them, because apparently farm-raised tree rat meat was fattier than caught in the wild, which supposedly yielded a better recipe. I'm not going to try this one at home, although years ago, when I gave extra credit to students for making a Roman recipe, one student followed Apicius's recipe for stuffed dormouse and made it with chicken. And anyway.
Is
So,
a door rat, would that be like a modern squirrel? Because I've heard them, like, people snarkily say you tree rat, meaning it's a squirrel that can't make up its mind, you're trying to drive and it's right in front of you. I mean.
yes, they are a close relative. Yes.
Okay.
But no evidence of Romans eating elephants.
Well, I have plenty at my house to share.
Another food-related question. What was the main ingredient in the Roman condiment garum? It was a super popular sauce. I think of it as kind of like the Chick-fil-A sauce of the Roman world. So what was the main ingredient? A, rotten tomatoes, B, rotten squirrel or tree rat, C, rotten fish, or D, fermented barley. So choose your poison.
I'd say barley. Maybe something fermented sounds like more of a condiment, kind of a saucy thing, but I don't know. I haven't been right so far.
I would say barley too. I would at least hope it was barley.
Yeah, I
Did
guess.
I hear,
I'm batting 1,000, so.
did I hear somebody say fish?
Yeah.
You are correct. Garum was
Nice.
a fish sauce, and the first step in that fish sauce was spreading out like the fish paste to rot for a few months. So rotting in a controlled environment. Then you strain it and mix it with olive oil and some spices. Good stuff, supposedly.
Has it sounds interesting. Would people, I mean, people actually ate that stuff?
Oh yeah. Well,
Sounded pretty powerful.
yeah. Presumably a little gave a lot of a kick. But keep in mind that we're talking getting flavor in a world that didn't have our modern kind of plethora of spices.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's switch gears to geography. In good weather, how long did it take to travel from Jerusalem to Londinium in the 1st century AD? So what's your guess? 3 weeks, 3 months, 2 weeks, or 2 months?
And would they be traveling by foot or by cart or just caravan? I guess, would it make a difference? The mode of transportation?
It would.
Mhm.
I would guess
2
maybe
weeks,
2
I don't
months.
know.
I would guess maybe 2 months.
You are right. So the modern estimate is about 56.6 days. So I would round it to 2 months. And that's in the summer. Now, the trick question would have been, had I asked you, how long would it take you to travel that in the winter? Because the answer is no time at all, because you wouldn't be traveling in the winter. So keeping in mind that people in the ancient world did not take open sea voyages, you are kind of, the shortest way to go is to sail, but sailing from like one place to another close by. So you would start with in Jerusalem, travel to the shore, and then you'd go from there to Cyprus, then kind of leapfrog to Rhodes, Crete, and keep going, leapfrogging, only crossing like the least amount of seawater that you can at a time. And then eventually, of course, you do get to Gaul, and you have to cross Gaul by cart or foot, and then you sail across to Britain. So it's a combination voyage. So it is kind of impressive, actually, when you think about that in the middle of the summer, when the seas were calm, it would have taken 2 months. So, but yeah, it's a reminder of how long everything took. So information flow, goods, letters, so anything, traveling to visit somebody, you have to really like them if you're going to travel across the empire. And finally, last but not least, true or false? the Romans did not have the concept of 7-day weeks. What do you think?
False.
Everybody
Don't
agree?
we have our modern from the Roman calendar? It's where we get our modern calendar, so it would have the 7 days. So I guess that would be false. But again, I 50-50 chance of being right on this one.
That's true. Well, so you're right that we get the modern calendar in some shape from the Romans. So especially the concept of 30-day months. So this is a cleaned up version of a surviving Roman calendar from the 1st century BC. But as you can see, it was not very, it's not necessarily organized by weeks, although you do have days numbered going from A to H to show market days. But they did not have the concept of weeks the way we know it. That's something that started with the Christians, the idea of the 7-day, the Sabbath, the first day of the week being recognized. And in fact, it was not until Constantine that became part of the Roman official calendar. So the Christians really brought that in. Obviously, the Jews had it all along, but it was not recognized in the Roman world until Constantine. So that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So they had the concept of months, which we get from them, but not the concept of 7-day weeks. All right.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
It's very interesting.
Well, there are a lot of things we get from the Romans, and we kind of assume that we get them in a very similar shape. And sometimes we do, but at other times there's some nuances. And one thing that is important to remember is also just how much we get from the Christian side of the Roman world. And so like the concept of weeks goes back to the theological foundation. Well, so let's shift gears and talk about Cyprian and his experience of pastoring through a pandemic in the mid-3rd century AD. So why talk about Cyprian in 2021? And you've probably never heard of him, by the way, I'm guessing, before this, which is okay.
No.
Well, so timeless relevance. So we'll see the church at Carthage was an ethnically and racially diverse large congregation that was going through a time of extreme crisis of different types. Second, looking at Cyprian's story allows us to talk about the impact of pandemics on pastors. So for those of you who have a church home, you've probably noticed that your pastors have probably been pretty stressed over the past year and a half. And there's just so much that is going on. And as historians, we can take a step back and look at that story in perhaps a little bit less involved light. But also, the story of Cyprian allows us to look at impact of pandemics on churches and just what we would call everyday Christians. So he left a lot of writings, so letters that he wrote to people in his church, people in other churches across the empire, sermons that talk about issues in his congregation, and also different treatises. And finally, there are lessons there that we can get from stories like Cyprian, and in general from writings from the early church. Lessons on how churches can be effective witness to society at times of crisis. And I thought that was kind of a funny image, because a lot of times for historians, we get distracted. All the history is always there are always crises in history, right? And it's distracting. But in this particular case, actually, for me researching Cyprian and the church at Carthage over the past year and a half, it's been kind of interesting to realize that the historic crisis I was living through, that we're all still living through in some way, is actually quite similar to the historic crisis that I'm researching. So it's been an interesting kind of marriage of ideas coming together. So before we get into anything else, let's take a step back and talk about the background. So the story of Carthage, from Punic colony to Roman provincial capital. And that's a story that starts in the mid-9th century BCE. So over a century before there was such a thing as Rome, or a village on the Tiber, the Phoenicians set out a colony to Carthage in modern-day Tunisia. And the Phoenicians were known for their skill in sailing the Mediterranean. They had very advanced technology for navigation and sailing long before, well, again, long before there was such a thing as Romans, or really long before anybody else in the Mediterranean had that kind of technology. But they were specifically interested in trade. So if you imagine, so the Phoenicians were located in what is modern day Lebanon. So all the way, so settling a colony all the way in Carthage in North Africa, modern day Tunisia, was a way to control sea trade routes and establish a new center that allowed them to get into other parts of the Mediterranean. Well, and then in the mid-8th century BCE, according to Roman legend, Romulus founded Rome. So at that point, Carthage was already kind of an established city. And in the early history of Rome, of course, the Romans were mostly focused on issues at home, while at that same time, the Phoenicians and also the Greeks were colonizing around the Mediterranean. So that period from the 8th century to the 6th century BC, the Phoenicians and the Greeks were taking over any sites they could around the Mediterranean, strategically expanding trade routes. Let me show you a map. So all the red is locations of Greek colonies, and all the yellow is Phoenician colonies. So you can see the Phoenicians really got around, considering that they were a tiny, a really tiny territory in the, I guess, the home country. So if you look at Phoenicia, so look just north of Israel, and you can see their cities there. They really got quite far around the Mediterranean, so very strategic locations, although mostly focusing on the southern half of the Mediterranean. But again, they were flourishing beautifully. Well, and so the story that is going on at that same time, the Phoenicians are colonizing the Mediterranean, are doing beautifully in expanding their wealth and so on. And Carthage becomes a great city in its own right, far overshadowing its, well, mother country in its success. The Romans slowly start expanding. So if you look, what I like about this map is that it shows just that gradual nature of expansion. So starting with that tiny little like dark red area in 500, then by late-ish in the 4th century, you see an expanded red, and then it keeps growing. You see that pink, you see that orange. And so finally, by the late 3rd century BC, you see the Romans have taken over the entire Italian peninsula and also Sicily, which they got as a result of the First Punic War, and Sardinia and Corsica. Now look here. So look south of Sicily, and here's Carthage. So can you see Carthage on the map there? Yeah. So it's facing, so you can see it's facing Italy.
Mhm.
And so in some ways it makes sense that as the Romans became increasingly more powerful, their interests suddenly clashed with the Carthaginians, or not really suddenly. Again, it's one of those things where you look at two powerful states who are starting to get into each other's territory, and it makes sense. So this map shows an expanded view of the Mediterranean and the Carthaginian sphere of influence before the first war they had with the Romans. And so you can see that the Carthaginians controlled quite a few territories not far from the Roman world. And so the Romans ended up fighting a series of 3 wars with the Carthaginians. And by the way, that was a common pattern for the Romans. With quite a few nations, they ended up fighting multiple wars, in several cases 3 or 4, because they usually did not set out to annihilate the enemy unless they absolutely had to. So the First Punic War really was a war over control of Sicily. And the Romans won. And as you can see, it was a pretty long conflict from 264 to 241. The Second Punic War, and that's the one that everybody has probably heard about, so that's the war with Hannibal, lasted from 218 to 202. And the result of this war was that the Romans gained control of the areas of the Mediterranean that were previously under Carthaginian control. So by the end of the Second Punic War, the Romans basically closed the circle. So if you think of the Mediterranean as a circle, the Romans now have it. And then the Third Punic War was in some ways perhaps unnecessary, but it was really the result of one man. I mean, look at this face. Can you say no to this guy? So this is Cato the Elder, who for about a year, very late in his career, ended every speech in the Senate. And he was the ultra-conservative Roman senator. For over a year, he would end every speech by saying, and in addition to whatever else I just said, I say that Carthage must be destroyed. And it seems like after a while, everybody had enough of this. It's like, okay, fine, we'll destroy Carthage. And so they do. The Third Punic War happens. Carthage is wiped out. But that's where our story picks up. So the Romans then have this territory, and the question is, what do you do with it? And I didn't include it in this timeline, but there was a really small attempt in 122 BC to start a new colony there that failed for political reasons. But then in 49 to 44 BC, Julius Caesar takes a vested interest in this region, and he founds a new colony, so a new city of Carthage that is a Roman colony, meaning it's settled with a lot of Roman people who wanted land, keeping in mind that Italy is very crowded at this point and running out of land, but also some natives. So North Africans also live in this city. And within a century and a half, it is up to 500,000, which is a massive city by ancient standards. I mean, it's massive by modern standards too, but by ancient standards especially. So they get up to 500,000 population, which is half the population of Rome. So you think like, that's a big city. And it becomes eventually the capital of the Roman province of Africa. And what's important to our story today, it becomes one of the key centers of North African Christianity. In fact, it becomes the most important church for North African Christianity because the pastor of that church, the Bishop of Carthage, and bishop, by the way, when we say bishop, it's essentially the title for the local pastor, the head pastor of the local church in a particular city. And the Bishop of Carthage was essentially de facto head of the church in Africa. And over time, what we see is an extremely diverse population. And in general, the Roman Empire was a very diverse place. If you were walking down the streets in Rome, you would see people of every skin color. But this was especially so for Carthage and cities in North Africa, because you would have people who moved from other parts of the Roman world, but you would also have the native North Africans, people moving from the south, say Numidia. And so it had a very specific kind of distinctive flavor that this was a Romanized city. It looked very Roman. The buildings would look really Roman. The cultural institutions looked very Roman, and yet it was also very much North African. So for example, the famous amphitheater at Carthage, which had a capacity of seating 30,000 people, and it still survives in decent shape today. And that's an example of kind of the Roman influence that that we see in cities that the Romans built across the empire. In general, whenever you think of Romans, whenever they came anywhere, the two sides of civilization were building a Roman bath and building theater or some sort of center for entertainment.
Sure, of course.
So let's look at how Cyprian's own story fits into this. And I want to tell you a little bit about him from birth to conversion, because his story in some ways is a story of a lot of Christians in his period. So what we know, and a lot of it is just kind of reconstructing things from little references that he made and little references that others made. He was born to a reasonably affluent family in Carthage sometime around the year 200. And that date is significant because right around then, we have a really remarkable text that survives from right around 202 CE or AD. The martyrdom account of Perpetua and Felicity, who were martyred in a persecution that may have been local, may have been part of a more concerted persecution, we're not sure. But it's a really remarkable text because included in it is the prison diary of Perpetua, a local noblewoman who was martyred. And so she kept a prison diary as she was waiting to be executed for her faith, and just talking about it in really encouraging and just remarkable ways. And the fact that this document survived, it's really fascinating. But the point that I'm trying to make here is she was also from a noble family in the city. So in the small circle of noble families in any city, you would expect people to know each other. And chances are her family and the family of Cyprian knew each other. And perhaps for a lot of other noble families in Carthage, it would have been a story to tell for years to come that stay away from these people. Like, nothing good happens if you become a Christian. And keep in mind, of course, that around the year 200, the percentage of Christians in the Roman Empire, percentage of the population of the Roman Empire that is Christian, is a fraction, a tiny fraction of 1%. Very, very few. So Cyprian was born around the year 200. We know that he received the perfect kind of education that you would expect an aristocrat to receive. And in fact, as we think about another North African intellectual leader, a century later, Augustine, and his education would have been very similar to what Cyprian experienced. So it would have focused on learning to be a great orator. And he became an orator, maybe not a super famous or great one, but he became a professional orator, speechwriter, lawyer, possibly. And also we know that he taught. So he taught rhetoric to others for a while. Now, there are a lot of silences. For instance, we never hear of a wife or family. But in the Roman world, pretty much everybody got married. And especially if you were from an aristocratic family, chances are he was married at some point, but lost his wife. And if they had any children, presumably those died as well. So at some point in the mid 240s AD, Cyprian had a crisis, and that crisis led him to the church. So somebody who had lived the first 45 or so years of his life outside the church as a typical Roman aristocrat of sorts, suddenly joins the church. And what is especially remarkable, he converts, he gives away most of his possessions, and the most remarkable of all, he is fast-tracked into church leadership. We don't know exactly why, but one key or one clue potentially is all the writings that he left, which are really insightful sermons and letters and treatises that show a lot of compassion for people in crisis and just leadership skills for times of crisis, of which well, his entire time as bishop was a time of crisis. So it seems like perhaps the local church saw that potential in promoting him to bishop, even though he was a recent convert himself. And so the last decade of his life, he is the Bishop of Carthage, and it is a decade of turmoil in the Roman world. In general, when historians talk about the 3rd century, you hear the 3rd century crisis, and that's what Cyprian was living through. It was the 3rd century crisis, very much so, meaning this period was marked by political turmoil. So emperors were getting assassinated, it seems like every year. There was rampant inflation. So the cost of everything was higher. And in 251, it seems like we have the first empire-wide organized persecution of Christians. And Cyprian was bishop through all of this. But arguably, and we don't know for sure, but if you were to ask him, what was the greatest crisis that defined your ministry? I think the answer would have been the pandemic. And ironically, because he wrote so much about it, that pandemic later was dubbed by historians the plague of Cyprian, an unexpected legacy that he probably never foresaw. So what was this plague? Well, we have snippets of evidence about it from all over the Roman Empire. But what we know is that at some point around 249, right as Cyprian became Bishop of Carthage, a virus jumped from most likely a bat onto a human host somewhere in Ethiopia and started traveling north. From there on, that virus traveled all over the empire. And so you have a map here of possible land routes and sea routes that this virus took as it touched the entire known world, affecting not only the Roman Empire, but as you can see, also getting into Persia, Asia, India, China, and just circulating for 20 years. And we have evidence that with this virus, it would attack a city and kill off a sizable chunk of the population quickly, and then it would disappear because it seems like people acquired immunity. But then it would resurface again, wiping out the newly unimmune populations. Historian Kyle Harper has argued quite convincingly that most likely the symptoms fit with a filovirus like Ebola. So most likely that's what we're talking about here, something like Ebola or a close cousin. And to quote from Kyle Harper, and if there's just one book that I could recommend to you today, I would recommend this book, Kyle Harper's The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, which is just a fascinating read. But what he argues is that this pandemic in the Roman Empire was an age-defining trauma. That, to read what he wrote about it, the one fact that virtually all of our sources agree upon is that a great pestilence defined the age. Inscriptions, papyri, archaeological remains, and textual sources collectively insist on the high stakes of the pandemic. In a recent study, I was able to count at least 7 eyewitnesses and a further 6 independent lines of transmission, whose testimony we can trace back to the experience of the pestilence. And for the first time, we have Christian testimony, and that's Cyprian. The church experienced a growth spurt during the generation of the plague, and the mortality left a deep impression in Christian memory. So this was an age-defining trauma, and for Cyprian, this was a trauma, a pandemic that affected his ministry in profound ways. And so he wrote one sermon specifically on this pandemic that he addressed to his church about it, trying to encourage them, but also trying to call people to care for each other in the middle of all of this. And he does not mince words. So this is a description of the symptoms that he includes in this particular sermon called On Mortality or On the Plague. This trial, that now the bowels relaxed into a constant flux, discharged the bodily strengths, and so on. So description of the symptoms, you have just gastrointestinal distress. You have some sort of fever in the whole body, and sores, ulcers in the throat, vomiting, bleeding from the eyes, and so on, and losing ability to operate your limbs in some cases. So a contagion of disease putrefaction in the feet and limbs, and just extreme weakness. People would die within just a few days of getting this disease. This was horrific, and it was such a source of fear and stress for a church that was already going through so much with persecution and, again, political turmoil and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do you lead people who are so discouraged, who are literally persecuted for their lives and have so much that they're losing? And it seems like the Christians of this age, including Cyprian himself, thought that they were living in the last days. And he says this, like, the world is coming to an end. We can see it. So what did it look like to pastor during a pandemic? So of course, pandemics raise theological questions. And we get a hint of some of those difficult theological questions that Cyprian had to deal with in his own church. So for example, he said, it disturbs some that the power of this disease attacks our people equally with the heathens. So the idea, it seems like some Christians in his church were asking him, like, well, why is this pandemic killing Christians just like non-believers? Shouldn't we be protected by the Holy Spirit? And he responded in here that it disturbs some that this mortality is common to us with others. And yet, what is there in this world which is not common to us with others, as long as this flesh of ours still remains? So the idea that, well, as Christians, you are in the world, but you're not of the world. And that means that, yes, a horrible disease can kill you. But he proceeds to talk about just, well, what does death mean to a Christian versus what does death mean to somebody who is not a believer? And so for Cyprian, this was an opportunity to preach about difficult theological truths that perhaps would not have gathered such a prominent place in his sermons in a different time. But on the one hand, he was dealing with these difficult theological questions from his congregation. But on the other hand, just because there is a pandemic and empire-wide crisis and all of this, what is remarkable is seeing that practical everyday concerns persist. So just everyday sin. And we get flavor of that from his letters and sermons. So for example, the question of how do you integrate converted sinners into the church? So one letter that he wrote to the elders in his church talks about a fascinating case study of an actor. Now, mind you, actors in the Roman world were a disgraced profession. So it was a dishonorable profession that was recognized as just like, these are not people that we would want to be around. Well, and here's a story. This actor converted and became part of the church, but he didn't know what else he could do as a profession. So he continues to teach acting, which Cyprian says, like, that's not appropriate. And so ultimately he writes this letter to the elders saying, we need to care for this guy. And one way to do that would be for the church to support him for a while until he can figure out a new career or a different way to live. But one way or another, we have to spiritually support and just materially support this member of our body. We cannot just judge what he does for a living without offering a practical solution. And that's something that really comes through the practical solutions to dealing with sinners in a church. Another one, the question of how do you support single women in the church? And that's something that's been a problem in the ancient Mediterranean really throughout in society. So keeping in mind that the Roman world did not have a social safety net, not really anyway. The idea is really that family supports you. So throughout the New Testament, whenever you have Jesus talking about supporting the widows, and that's those kinds of the people who have nobody to take care of them, support them, and all of that, who would literally die of starvation if somebody did not help them out. So I think about, say, the Old Testament book of Ruth, where Naomi is convinced that they will die because they have nobody to take care of them. And that's a real fear. She's not just being dramatic. This is a real concern. And so Cyprian is very much worried about supporting women in the congregation. And it seems like almost every other letter has an extra clause saying something like, by the way, let's remember to keep fundraising to support the single women or widows in the church. Another one, how to help in crisis. So there's one letter of his that's quite fascinating that tells a story that shows the cooperation of Christians across churches, not just in Carthage, but in other cities. So he got a letter from a group of pastors to the south in the poorer churches in Nadya who had a crisis situation. Now, a group of Christians from several different churches were abducted in a raid on a local city location. Keeping in mind that, like in Nadya, you have the Romanized parts of the region, but you still have the unromanized barbarians, as people still refer to them. And so these people in some cases, made a living out of kidnapping anybody they could and selling them into slavery. And that in general was just a pattern we see in the ancient world. Again, lack of safety, lack of social safety nets, but also just the vulnerability, how easy it would be for somebody to get kidnapped and sold into slavery. And so in this case, these church leaders write to Cyprian and say, like, here's the situation that we have. And he writes back this really beautiful letter talking about how being one in the body means that we have to help these people. And so he immediately fundraises an immense sum of money. Just, it's really astonishing, and sends it back to the church in Nadya, to the churches that contacted him to ransom the captives. No one has money, and yet they find something. They are able to fundraise this immense sum to save other Christians in their network, not even from their own church, but from another area, from other area churches. But finally, so on the one hand, we see these encouraging kind of instances where Cyprian brings people together to do something beautiful. But at the same time, this is also a time of persecution. And Cyprian has an unusual problem in his church that he talks about from time to time. And that's the problem of people who really want to be martyrs. So some people actually really were determined to die a martyr's death in the persecution, which, you know, you think like, these are really dedicated Christians. And yet for them, it became an idol that they held the desire to be martyred over anything else. So they would refuse to minister to those who were sick from the plague because they did not want to die from the plague. They wanted to save themselves to die in martyrdom. And so Cyprian has pretty harsh words to say about these people, that God is in control of when and how you will die, and not taking care of your fellow believers is not an option just so you can save yourself to be a martyr. So I guess I'll try to tie these things together. I just threw a lot of information at you. As you can see, we have quite an archive of an ancient pastor, just all kinds of writings about difficult situations and problems that he was able to resolve in some cases, not quite able to resolve in other cases, but that still are a taste of what it was like to be a pastor in a time of crisis, and also what it was like to be church members in a time of crisis. And so there are a lot of takeaways here about the church in a pandemic. And to me, what is super encouraging is to think that in 200 AD, less than 1% of the Roman Empire were Christians. By 300 AD, about 10% of the Roman Empire were Christians. So this century, in which Cyprian's ministry is just one decade in this century, in the middle of the century, but this was the century of immense growth for the church. Despite all of the crisis of the age, political, economic, pandemic, and yet that's a time of growth. And that is so fascinating because the question is why? And the reason for that is what the church did. So the church became the safety net for those who had no safety net. And I think that's a beautiful reminder for us today, for Christians, that churches can do this. There is no rule that only Roman Empire, churches in the Roman Empire have a monopoly on serving their communities. This is something that is just as relevant, a reminder today as it was in the 3rd century AD. But also we see a theology of redeemed suffering. Living in the modern world, we don't like to think about suffering too much. We have modern medicine most of the time, it's quite reliable, and so on. We don't think about, I mean, it's kind of remarkable to think that up until, early 20th century, for a lot of families, if you had a lot of kids, chances are, like statistically, 1 or 2 of your children might die or more. Things like that, or death in childbirth, death of random infections before the age of antibiotics and all of that. So for churches before the modern era, it was easier to have a theology of redeemed suffering. And that's something that sometimes we lose because we just don't have to suffer the way they did. We don't expect to die young. But the pandemic, I think, really renewed the reminder of that theology. What does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? So difficult kind of topics that pastors have always talked about, but perhaps the believers in different congregations were not always eager to hear about. But those truths are very relevant today. And so that's that question: how do you live in the already but not yet? And I think Cyprian's experience, and just in general, this experience of living through a pandemic, pastoring through a pandemic, being church members in a pandemic, brings up these important questions. And of course, a pastor's job is never easy. So be nice to your pastors. That's their job has not been easy in the past year and a half. It's never easy, but it has been especially difficult now. So I have some books here, recommendations for further reading. And otherwise, I'm going to stop and just let people ask questions. And some of these are a little more academic than others. So Kyle Harper's book I mentioned earlier is super readable. David Wilhite's Ancient African Christianity is also quite readable. Brent Shaw's book is fascinating, but it's almost 1,000 pages. So this is one of those, like if you want to nerd out, this is more of a Christie kind of book, probably. And a great introduction just to Cyprian and Roman Carthage is Brent Alan Brent's book, sorry, Cyprian and Roman Carthage. So
I
it's
just
like,
I had to take a quick picture of the screen because I can't write that fast.
I did the same.
Um,
Thank you. This is a wealth of information.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadya. As always, super interesting lecture from beginning to end. When you started to wind down, I was like, but she just started. Oh, it's almost 7 o'clock. Thank you so much for that. If you don't mind, I would like to open it up to some questions. But one thing too, I also wanted to mention is that Nadya has been writing a lot of published articles recently, going a little bit more in depth on what she just lectured about. One in particular that just sticks in my mind talks about Cyprian, exactly what we were talking about today, and him addressing the church as they all gathered, how to help others in the community, even outside the church, how to help themselves with the fear of the pandemic, and just, consider your neighbor more than yourself, basically, was the gist of it. And that just really stuck with me through this last bit of the pandemic. So I want to thank you for writing that, Nadya. I shared it. I was like, everybody needs to read this. If everybody just read this, there would not be this struggle. I feel like, anyway. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. Williams, or is there anything else you would like to add?
I think I'll stop sharing. You feel free to send out the PowerPoint. I mean, that's, if that helps people. 'Cause I know.
I'd love a copy of that. That would be great.
I think I saw that Brenda had a question in the chat
Okay. Let me open the chat.
earlier.
Sorry, that's a while back. I didn't know if that was.
Oh yeah. So you yeah. So the Prison Journal of Perpetua, she was in her 20s. She was quite young. She was but although by Roman standards, so in her early 20s, she was already married, she had a baby. So part of her story is just kind of her decision that her faith meant more to her than even her baby, whom she ends up leaving behind with her family. So it's a difficult read, really emotional.
I can see that.
I actually had a question. So you were talking about the actor and just having to deal with just regular day-to-day things, and just studying history, and I had to go through all periods in school. Actors have this reputation of being rather morally loose, rather promiscuous, maybe even prostitutes, most of them, most likely, even, and this carries on until the 1800s and early 20th century, with like ballerinas and stuff in the French ballet. They were all prostitutes as well. So is that something that we see in antiquity as well? Were they considered, like, was it prostitution specifically, or was it just moral looseness?
So they weren't quite at the level of prostitutes, but they were one of those disreputable professions. There's a great book, I'm putting the title in the chat, Sarah Bond, Trade and Taboo. I think the full title is like Trade and Taboo, Disreputable Professions in the Ancient World. Because there were quite a few other professions that were not as well regarded.
Right.
But actors were especially so. And part of the issue so they were very much disreputable by Roman standards, and moral looseness was definitely a part of it. But in addition to that, by Christian standards, Peter Brown has argued that they became even more disreputable because anything that actors did usually involved paganism. So all of the plays would have been performing pagan myths, and yeah.
True, exactly. Yeah, didn't even think about the paganism aspect. I was just thinking of like the later aspects. So that's interesting. Yeah, because it's amazing how too, like, I love to read Greek myths, and I don't even think about the fact that I'm a Christian and I love to read all of this pagan literature because it's not a big deal, right?
Well,
But
let me give you a good justification to keep reading Greek mythology. So the reason I think that all Christians should read Greek mythology is because it gives you an idea, an insight into the worldview of the early Christians. Like, what were they converting from? What was the views of gods that they had before? And if you read Greek mythology, you realize, like, this is a world in which gods hate humans, abuse them in every way imaginable. So imagine, like, the kind of hope that you would feel if you converted from that to Christianity. The idea, it's like, God loves you. It's like, what? What kind of crazy thing is this?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I've loved Greek myths since I was a kid. Started reading Norse myth more recently in the last, I guess, 10 years or so. Been revisiting those a lot, and that's my ancestry. And so it's crazy to think about, while the Jewish people were like writing the Torah, and then later, early Christianity is coming about, my ancestors were like believing in Odin and sacrificing goats to trees and,
Yeah.
all this stuff. And that that hopelessness, like you're saying, of just the violence and they were like just chaff in the wind, to these gods. And yeah, so it's crazy to think about. Well, does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Williams?
Dr. Williams, do you actually teach online classes or do things like that? I'd love to find out more. I feel like I just got an appetizer of just listening to you. It's like I could listen to you more, and like I just makes me want to have more questions and just really follow up on some things. But do you do online teaching, or where are you? You're in Georgia somewhere. I know I'm in Maryland, so
Okay.
it would no matter what, but I'd love to just find out more what your academic endeavors are, if people could be, I don't know, take your classes or anything like that.
I do teach here in Georgia at the University of West Georgia. It's one of those things where you can, on the one hand, you can read a lot. If you decide that you want to study more, there are always opportunities. And since you're in Maryland, you probably could find a program closer by with in-state tuition and so on. And a lot of universities now, including West Georgia, do offer online classes. So that is definitely something that is an opportunity that's available. And depending on the state, there are different kind of rules. So sometimes you get a very discounted rate for auditing a class as opposed to taking it for credit.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know. Very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Yeah.
I always love it when Dr. Williams lectures. She's awesome. And she's done, just to give her some shout outs, she's like one of the smartest people I know. She knows like Russian and Hebrew, and lived in Israel for a while and in Russia for a little bit. And she knows Greek and Latin. She's a classicist. So she's the one that I go to. She's done almost all of the Latin translation on either replicas or artifacts here at the Biblical History Center. She's just an excellent resource. And what are some things that you have going on right now that we should look out for, whether it's articles or books, or where can we read more of your work?
Well, I now have a monthly column on the Anxious Bench blog. So I have something there coming every month. And I try to write for other venues as well. So I've written quite a bit for Current more recently. I'm writing a couple of book projects right now, and that always takes longer. Books, yeah, you don't just write one a month. Yeah. So I'm finishing a book project on sinners in early churches, because a lot of times we think of early Christians as really just holy people who are better than us. And the whole point is that the everyday Christian, the average Christian in any church would have actually looked a lot more like the average Christian today. So, so looking at stories, not just from Cyprian, but I actually start with the New Testament and go to the age of Augustine, looking at particular types of sins that people struggled with. Just the idea of culture, like how does your culture influence you? So what does cultural Christianity look like in the Roman world, even before the empire is a Christian empire? But then what does cultural Christianity look like after Constantine's conversion? So at one point, the last chapter in the book is looking at people who decided, everybody's so sinful, we're just going to quit church. And that's the desert saints. So there's this whole movement of those desert saints, people like Saint Anthony, who say, like, forget the world, I'm moving to a desert and going to live on like 3 figs a day for the next 40 years. And we have this whole genre of saints' lives. So these people who decided, like, I'm going to quit everybody. But so I'm talking, and in that chapter, that's the concluding chapter to the book, but what I'm trying to argue there is it's not really a practical solution, and that's why it never took off. You can't really do that. And with those saints' lives, what you see really is an ambiguity that even people there in the ancient world realized that these guys are took this a little too far, that sin is just part of being in community with people, and you have to stay in community to grow.
And sin will just follow you to the desert. So
Yes. Yeah. Even as you mortify your flesh by eating nothing but 3 figs a day.
Okay.
kind of a relatable sentiment though. The last couple of years, there have been a couple of times where it's just popped into my mind, I could just move off to a mountain and live off of like a cliff somewhere.
The problem is you realize I'm the problem and I'm the one moving.
Yeah,
It's not gonna
my
go
sin's still gonna follow me along, like my little shadow, as long as I'm on this mortal plane. Yeah.
Well, I love the inspiration for just for people who come, converting into the church, and what that must have looked like then kind of challenged me. I'd love to know, from his writings, Cyprian's writings, just you talked about his compassion and his love and his concern. And, I just think that would be a wonderful conversation to have, in your own church, in your small group to, what can that look like for us? I love, you've probably read Rosaria Butterfield. The unlikely, what is it, of an unlikely convert? The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. Oh, that was radical to me. Just that, looking at that pastor, and how he and his wife, through hospitality and just a lot of interesting ways, they loved her. Just touched my heart, and would love to see myself as well as others really learn how to do that and what that really looks like, that, just practically, just the list you gave of all the practical things that he had to deal with. That was, that was challenging. I think so many times we can become so inwardly focused and not be where we need to be in our community with unbelievers. And
I think that's wonderful. Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned Rosaria Butterfield, because early on in the pandemic, I read a short op-ed that she wrote about trying to reach out to her community, and realizing that people were actually a little bit suspicious initially, but they were doing, I think she and her husband and their church were organizing, I think, food drop-offs essentially, and people gained some respect for them as a result of that, just trying to reach out to their non-Christian neighbors. And and in some ways you think well, why are people so suspicious when, non-Christians suspicious of Christians reaching out to them? But it's also interesting to think that's, again, the sort of thing that the early church would have been dealing with when you're living among unbelievers.
yeah.
The mindset of the world.
Yeah. Well, and just that example of they had so little but gave so much. And I just know that's what Paul said about which church was it that he was so proud of. Well, the Jerusalem church. No.
He was collecting to support the Jerusalem
For
church.
the Jerusalem church, but he went in all the churches that he went around. But I was thinking there was one specific church that he praised for ministering to the Jerusalem church, and I'm drawing a blank. But just
Isn't it the
that,
Philippians?
maybe
He's out
so.
of there.
But I don't know. But they were. I remember him saying that he says they just gave out of their need. They were so.
Yeah.
It's always inspiring. So lots to think about, but thank you for that history and just really, really tugging at the heart, along with it's not just history, but tugging at the heart. I appreciate that.
Yes. So does anyone have any other questions for Dr. Williams? Okay, well, Nadia, thank you so much for taking time out of your, I know, busy schedule with 3 kids and full-time professor and your writing and everything to give us a lecture. I really enjoyed it. I was so excited to have you speak again. Would love to have you again sometime. It's always a treat. Thank you all for joining us from all over Georgia, from Maryland, for the lecture. It was fun. And little plug for our next lecture. I'm trying to do 1 lecture every quarter. So our next lecture is actually going to be one of my archaeology friends. It's Dr. Matthew Adams in February. He is the director of the W.F. Albright Institute in Jerusalem. So it used to be ASOR, the American School of Oriental Research, overseeing all Middle Eastern American excavations, but now Oriental is not politically correct, so they changed it to the W.F. Albright Institute. So still same institution. And he is actually the director of the Legio 6 excavations currently ongoing on the plains of Megiddo. So very juicy dig site. I'm sure he's going to have lots to say. Smart guy, nice guy, very hospitable. Every time we go to Jerusalem, he's always like, would you like an American newspaper? Would you like some tea? Right? So very nice man. So he's going to be coming in February. I'm going to post that on our website in the next month or 2 and on our Facebook page. So be on the lookout for that. It'll be virtual just like this because, you know, he's going to be in Israel. So, so yeah, I encourage everyone to come to that. And thank you for joining us tonight on a Friday night.
Yeah, thank you. Loved it.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And bye, guys.
Thanks very much. We'll see y'all.
Bye. Bye.